Hey everyone, it's LS, and this is the World's Patch 6.18 Solo Queue tier list. And I know that it's been a while since I've done another tier list. The last one that I did was in patch 6.13, and since then a lot of things have changed. So let's get into some of the things that you're going to see inside of this tier list. But before we do that, I want to mention that again, if this is your first time watching a tier list video, there is going to be the categories of S, A, and B tier. S tier is going to be champions that you can expect to have a much higher positive result with if you do end up selecting that champion. A tier is still going to be a relatively reasonable pick for that MMR, and then B tier is going to be a pick that maybe you find some comfort on, but I don't rate it nearly as highly as an A or an S tier pick. Also, again, if this is your first time seeing the tier list as well, if you're wondering why some champions that you might have been expecting to see are just not anywhere on the tier list at all, it's mainly because that, all things considered, when you're thinking about the matchups that they're likely to encounter at that MMR, or the skill required to play that champion, I personally just don't think that it's a worthwhile investment, and I think that the other champions that I've listed on the tier list are infinitely better than the champion that is perhaps missing entirely from a certain MMR, or if the champion that you're expecting, if you think they belong higher up on the list, the same reasoning applies. Okay, so one of the things that you're going to be noticing immediately when you're looking at this tier list is that at the lower MMRs, even through the highest MMRs, Zac is now S tier. So Zac is a champion that in recent patches, with all the nerfs to other junglers, but also just the changes to mid and top lane champions, it actually enables Zac to be a lot better than he was a while ago, even though there might have been some arguments that he could have been a little bit sleeper. But Zac is a champion that, even though he is pretty good and he has a pretty nice kit, he still is at the mercy of other champions existing inside of the meta to some degree. Anyways, now he enters as an S tier in patch 6.18, and he's probably going to be around for a while, barring any major changes or, balance design to other champions that currently exist. So I recommend picking him up as one of your primary junglers. Literally, it doesn't matter what MMR you're in, he's going to be a good pick. Also, something else that some people might be noticing is that Skarner and Evelynn are also getting very popular in this tier list. Even in Bronze, I list them as A tier picks, even through Silver and moving into Gold. This is primarily because Evelynn's permanent cloak and the amount of damage that she deals, as well as the most recently developed itemization paths, lead Evelynn to be extremely powerful at snowballing and just closing out the game really early. Skarner, again, with nerfs to other jungle champions that have happened in the most recent of patches, enables Skarner to take on the role of basically an off-tank that also has the ability to just delete someone in a late-game teamfight by ulting them into your teammates. Skarner is going to be a pretty good pick right now, especially because his clear is relatively safe and healthy, and he has a lot of extra mobility moving around the map because of his spires. Another thing that you might have noticed on this tier list is that Swain is still king. Basically, in mid and top, Swain is still going to be the sustain monster that punishes a lack of communication, which is extremely prevalent in solo queue. Swain is probably a pick that, people aren't expecting to continue to see on the tier list, even though everything still makes sense for picking him, in the fact that he's really durable, he's extremely oppressive, and the only way to take him down is generally through proper coordination and proper team fighting play, which is, again, absent inside of solo queue. You will have realized, though, that his brother, basically Vladimir, is completely absent from the tier list until the highest of levels, and this is primarily because Vladimir continuously was hit over a few patches, and then also the changes to mid and top laners that have occurred in the most recent patches. Moving on, another unique champion that probably no one was expecting to see is going to be Mordekaiser. You'll notice that Mordekaiser is trickling into all of the tiers, and even at the highest tiers, I'm actually placing the rating on him pretty high. Because of some of the changes that have occurred, again, inside of the meta in recent patches, and because of the solving or figuring out of how Mordekaiser does interact in certain lanes and certain matchups, as well as how strong he is in the later stages of the game because of Dragon, Mord is actually getting slowly better and better in terms of being a viable pick, even in the highest tiers. If you'll watch Korean solo queue recently, you'll also notice that there is a player named FaZe Killer, which for months on end has actually been beating the best pros in the world, at least in solo queue, using Mordekaiser, and in recent weeks, a lot of pros have also began to pick him up. Mordekaiser is generally a champion that gets punished by constantly pushing too much and not really having any sort of an escape from ganks. At lower MMRs, junglers aren't going to just gank you endlessly, and the coordination between the laner and the jungler is not really going to be on point in order to take down a Mordekaiser, given how strong his healing is and his obnoxious shield. So at lower MMRs, if you're looking for a fun pick that is also pretty oppressive inside of laning phase and has the ability to 3-shot people, Mordekaiser's your guy. Another champion pick that is also trickling through a lot of the tiers is now Akali. With the changes to Protobell and also the different types of itemization paths that have been being seen, at least on the Korean solo queue ladder, I think that Akali is basically a champion that is a little bit sleeper for a while now. But with the changes to top and mid lane champions over the last few patches, and the changes to some of the junglers, Akali actually gets a little bit better because generally she's a champion that has to survive the laning phase and then goes off later. But because of the simplicity in her itemization paths, and because of how straightforward her itemization is in her laning phase, it makes it a really easy pick to just pick up. In the lower MMRs, it still may be a little bit difficult to just go off and start deleting people's faces, but in higher MMRs, it's going to be very simple for how you're going to play the laning phase and how you're going to transition your laning phase into the mid game and ultimately the end game on Akali and just be a giant assassin. Because basically, the assassin role is something that currently in solo queue is lacking quite a lot, and Akali, even though she's an assassin, she technically has a lot of sustain and survivability. Okay, so speaking of mids and top laners, let's talk about the jungle. One thing that some people might have noticed is that Nocturne, with his most recent buffs, and the fact that he's basically a super Warwick or a super Shyvana, is why I'm placing Nocturne in certain tiers inside of the tier list. Nocturne, with his most recent buffs and the changes that have happened to him, as well as, again, changes to other junglers, make him the Super Warwick or the Super Shyvana. So if you're looking for one of the level 6 farming junglers that also deals a boatload of damage and offers a lot of control as soon as he hits 6, Nocturne's your guy. This is also why inside of this tier list version, you'll see that Shyvana and Warwick has fallen off, mostly because of Nocturne. Joining Nocturne as a rare sight for some people is probably going to be Kindred at the higher tiers. Some people might think that Kindred is dead and that she's completely absent from the game and there's no reason to pick her. That's just actually not true. Because of the nerfs to the other junglers that have happened, it actually makes Kindred a much more viable pick, at least in solo queue. Kindred is extremely mobile, has fascinating objective control, and is really, really simple. So because of all of this, and because of how jungle interacts inside of solo queue, even at the highest tiers, Kindred is actually going to be a pretty good pick when you're looking at the other junglers that are currently available. Finally, something else that some people might be wondering is, why is Gnar Shen so low? Well, Gnar and Shen are as low as they are because they're utility tank top laners. Even though Gnar in some matchups can basically be a lane bully, and he can even try to get some solo kills depending on, again, who the enemy laner is, he's just not a champion that you want to pick in solo queue if you look at all the other champions that are listed on this tier list alone that you could have picked instead. Gnar, when it does reach the mid and the later stages of the game, he does still require some management of his rage or his Gnar bar, and on top of that, he requires proper setup, and he requires all these things that you just don't want to have to be required to do inside of solo queue. And even if you do spend the time to learn Gnar, and you get to a point where you can do the things that he needs to do consistently, it's just not worth it in a solo queue environment when other champions exist. It would be like learning how to play Ganondorf at the highest level instead of learning how to play Fox. It's not going to be as effective when it comes to solo queue, because there's going to be variables of the game that are outside of your control when Gnar is basically required to be in control. Shen, like Gnar, is very similar. Shen is a champion that can completely turn the tides in other lanes given his ultimate, and because of how obnoxious he is when paired with teleport. So he can ultimate away to an opposing lane, force the enemy top laner to teleport, and then Shen teleports back to top lane, thus gaining lane advantage as well. But the problem with Shen is he does come with the cost, in that if your laners are not performing as well as they could be, sometimes it's just beyond your ability to help them. And Shen, given his carry potential, it's not really that high when you think about what happens if the laners are too bad, and then on top of that, you think about what kind of setups you actually need to make Shen an S tier pick, and then it's just not worth it. Finally, moving on and finishing off this tier list, I want to talk about Jayce, and I also want to talk about Kennen. A lot of people have been tweeting at me and asking me what are my thoughts on Jayce and Kennen. The changes to Jayce were absolutely gigantic, because the way that Jayce trades and the way that he goes for his all-in, the damage that he's gained in recent patches is enormous. Also, the damage loss that other top laners have received, and then on top of that, other mid laners, make Jayce actually bounce immediately back into the meta after basically being completely absent. Kennen, likewise, for the same reasoning, is also equally as powerful because of other champions that are now existing inside of the meta, and how strong Kennen is with Proto Belt and the new types of build paths that were introduced to him in the 6.9 Mage mid-season update. Finally, we'll go out with a bang and talk about AD carries. You'll notice that this time around the AD carries are a lot more plentiful inside of this tier list. This is because that all AD carries in recent patches have taken hits here and there. Because of that, Ezreal has actually been propelled to the S tier in Master and Challenger, whereas last time he was primarily absent because of the difficulty to actually play Ezreal. But because of hits that other AD carries have suffered, it also enabled all the B and A class AD carries to now get up inside of the tier list even higher, just because everything's becoming a little bit more useful. You'll notice that complex AD carries such as Caitlyn, Twitch, and Kog'Maw are basically on the low end almost constantly. This is because when I'm doing the tier list, I do factor in ping, and if you don't have proper ping, it becomes relatively difficult to play high intensity champions such as Caitlyn, such as Kalista, such as Vayne, and such as Kog'Maw. Because of this, and because of how unpopular some of the other ADCs are on the North American and European servers, that's why you see them listed as low as they are here. But, finishing it up, you still do just basically want to stick to the top 4 ADCs any opportunity that you get, because of how simplistic and straightforward their gameplay is, and what they need to do is. You don't want to have to worry about Tristana's passive and her split pushing and how she interacts inside of teamfights. You don't want to have to worry about Jinx's micromanagement of her passive. You don't want to worry about Draven and needing to get his kills or micromanaging his axes during teamfights. And you certainly don't want to have to worry about the endless kiting as Sivir when you could just basically stand still as Ashe, or do everything much simpler as Lucian, or have infinitely more mobility as Ezreal, or deal tons more damage as Jhin. Basically, the top 4 just do everything a little bit better than all of the other ADCs, at least in solo queue. Again, this is not a competitive tier list. The competitive Worlds tier list will be coming out right before Worlds goes live. Alright everyone, and so that's it for the patch 6.18 World Solo Queue tier list. Again, as I mentioned, there will be a competitive tier list, which is going to be released, and that's basically just going to be S, A, B tiers for what we can expect to see at Worlds, and why that is. That video will probably be much longer. If you haven't watched one of my tier list videos before, then I'm telling you right now that there is a stream where for about 2 hours I answer questions in chat about why are certain champions where they are on the tier list, and this time I'll probably let people come into Discord or something and argue or debate with me on certain champions' standings on the tier list, and that video will also probably be uploaded to YouTube. Maybe it'll be cut up a little bit, like the best questions or the best discussions, and you can find the info on when that stream will take place in the YouTube description below. And thanks all for watching, and go get MMR.